In the shadowy corridors of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of secrets lie buried beneath gilded portraits and marble floors, a single photograph hidden in the glove compartment of a Bentley would ignite the most explosive royal scandal in modern history. When Prince Alexander discovered the evidence that would tear his family apart, he faced an impossible choice: protect the crown's reputation or expose the truth that could destroy everything he held dear. What he found in that leather-bound folder would force him to confront not just his stepmother's darkest secrets, but the very foundations of the monarchy itself. The morning fog hung thick over the grounds of Windsor Castle as Prince Alexander stepped out of his silver Aston Martin, his breath visible in the crisp October air. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man born to rule, yet his emerald eyes betrayed a weariness that came from years of living under the world's most scrutinizing gaze. Today was supposed to be routine. A brief meeting with the estate managers about the upcoming Christmas celebrations, followed by a quiet drive back to London. Alexander had always preferred the solitude of these early morning visits to Windsor. The castle, with its ancient stones and towering walls, felt more like home than any of the other royal residences. Here, away from the constant flash of cameras and the whispered conversations of courtiers, he could think clearly. The weight of his future crown seemed lighter somehow within these walls where his ancestors had ruled for nearly a millennium. As he walked across the courtyard, his phone buzzed with the familiar tone reserved for palace communications. Sarah Mitchell, his private secretary, never contacted him this early unless something significant had occurred. He glanced at the screen. Urgent. Need to discuss vehicle situation before media briefing at noon. Alexander frowned, quickening his pace toward the main entrance. The massive oak doors, carved with the royal coat of arms, swung open as the doorman recognized his approach. Inside, the familiar scent of beeswax and old books greeted him, a comforting constant in his ever-changing world. His footsteps echoed through the grand corridor as he made his way to the private apartments. The castle seemed unusually quiet this morning. Normally, even at this early hour, there would be the subtle sounds of staff preparing for the day, the distant clatter of breakfast service, the soft murmur of security briefings, the gentle hum of activity that kept the royal household functioning. Instead, an almost oppressive silence filled the air, broken only by the ticking of the ancient grandfather clock in the main hall. Alexander's mind wandered to the events of the past few months. The pressure from Parliament had been mounting steadily, with whispers about modernizing the monarchy growing louder each day. The public's fascination with royal scandals seemed insatiable, and the media's appetite for controversy had only grown stronger since his father's death 2 years ago. Every decision, every public appearance, every relationship was dissected and analyzed with ruthless precision. His stepmother, Queen Consort Victoria, had been particularly vocal about maintaining traditional protocols. She argued passionately in private family meetings that any hint of impropriety could damage the crown's reputation irreparably. Victoria had married his father during a period of great turmoil for the royal family, and she had worked tirelessly to restore public confidence in the institution. Her efforts had been largely successful, but Alexander often wondered at what cost. The relationship between Alexander and Victoria had always been complex. She had entered his life when he was 25, already established in his royal duties and set in his ways. While she never tried to replace his beloved mother, who had died in a tragic accident when he was a teenager, Victoria had attempted to create a sense of family unity. Her efforts were well-intentioned, but Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that her primary concern was always the institution rather than the individuals within it. As he climbed the curved stone staircase to his private office, Alexander reflected on the conversation he'd had with Victoria just 3 days ago. They had been discussing the upcoming state visit from the President of France, and she had insisted on reviewing every detail of the itinerary personally. Her attention to protocol was admirable, but her intensity sometimes bordered on obsession. She spoke about protecting the royal legacy with a fervor that made Alexander uncomfortable, as if she carried the weight of the entire monarchy on her shoulders. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of his office, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet. Alexander settled into his leather chair and reached for his secure phone to call Sarah. Before he could dial, however, his attention was drawn to a soft knock at the door. "Enter," he called, expecting to see one of his usual attendants. Instead, James Weatherby, the head of royal security, stepped into the room. James was a man of few words, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to notice everything. He had served the royal family for over 20 years, and Alexander had never seen him look as troubled as he did at this moment. "Your Royal Highness," James began, his voice carrying an unusual tension. "I need to discuss a matter of extreme sensitivity with you. It concerns the Queen Consort's vehicle from last evening." Alexander gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit. What exactly happened?" James remained standing, a habit that suggested the gravity of whatever he was about to reveal. "Last night, after the charity gala at the Dorchester, Her Majesty's Bentley experienced mechanical difficulties on a return journey to Clarence House. The vehicle was towed to our secure facility for inspection." "I assume this is standard procedure?" Alexander asked, though something in James's demeanor suggested otherwise. "Yes, sir. However, during the routine security sweep of the vehicle, our team discovered something unusual." James reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope. These items were found hidden in a concealed compartment behind the glove box. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine as James placed the envelope on the desk between them. The weight of the moment seemed to press against his chest, and he had the distinct feeling that once he opened that envelope, there would be no going back. The morning sunlight suddenly felt harsh against his face, and the familiar comfort of his office seemed to evaporate. "What kind of items?" Alexander asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "Photographs, sir, and documents. I believe you should examine them personally before we proceed with any protocols." Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope. The paper felt heavy in his fingers, as if it contained more than just photographs and documents, as if it held the power to change everything. He looked up at James, searching the security chief's face for any hint of what lay ahead. "James, before I open this, I need to know, how many people are aware of this discovery?" "Only myself and the 2 technicians who found the items, sir. I've instructed them to maintain absolute discretion until we determine the appropriate course of action." Alexander nodded slowly, appreciating James's wisdom in containing the situation. Whatever was in this envelope had the potential to create a crisis, and until he understood the full implications, it was crucial to limit the number of people involved. The envelope felt warm in his hands now, as if it were alive with possibility and danger. Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever revelation awaited him. Outside his window, the morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle. Soon, the tourists would arrive, eager to catch a glimpse of royal life, completely unaware that within these ancient walls, a drama was unfolding that could shake the very foundations of the crown. With deliberate movements, Alexander opened the envelope and began to examine its contents. The first photograph made his breath catch in his throat. It showed Victoria in what appeared to be an intimate conversation with a man he didn't recognize, taken from a distance, but clear enough to be unmistakably her. The timestamp indicated it was taken just 6 months ago, long after she had become Queen Consort. The second photograph showed the same man handing Victoria what appeared to be a thick envelope, their meeting taking place in what looked like a private garden. Alexander's heart began to race as he realized the implications. If these photographs were authentic, they suggested a secret relationship that could destroy not only Victoria's reputation, but potentially the entire royal family's standing with the public. But it was the documents that truly made Alexander's blood run cold. Bank statements, transfer records, and what appeared to be correspondence between Victoria and several foreign entities. The amounts involved were staggering. Millions of pounds moving through accounts that Alexander had never heard of, all bearing Victoria's signature. As Alexander continued to examine the evidence, one name kept appearing in the documents: Marcus Pemberton. He recognized the name from newspaper articles. Pemberton was a businessman with questionable connections, someone who had been investigated multiple times for his dealings with various governments. If Victoria was involved with such a man, the scandal would be unprecedented. The final document in the envelope was perhaps the most damaging of all. It appeared to be a contract signed by Victoria, agreeing to provide privileged information regarding state matters in exchange for substantial financial compensation. The document was dated just 3 months ago, meaning that if it was authentic, Victoria had been selling state secrets while serving as queen consort. Alexander set the documents down with shaking hands and looked up at James, who had been watching him with quiet concern throughout the examination. "James, if these documents are authentic, we're looking at treason," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid that's my assessment as well, sir. The question now is how we proceed." Alexander stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the peaceful landscape that suddenly seemed fragile and threatened. Everything he had worked for, everything his family had built over centuries, could be destroyed by what lay in that envelope. The weight of kingship, which had always been an abstract concept in the future, now felt immediate and crushing. "We need to verify the authenticity of these materials before we do anything else," Alexander said finally. "But, James, if these prove to be genuine, we'll be facing the greatest crisis the monarchy has seen in modern times." As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, Alexander's phone rang with another call from Sarah. The outside world was continuing its relentless pace, unaware that within the walls of Windsor Castle, the future of the crown hung in the balance. Alexander knew that he had perhaps hours, maybe days at most, before this information would become public knowledge. The question was no longer whether to act, but how quickly he could move to protect the institution he was born to serve. The morning that had begun so peacefully had transformed into the beginning of what Alexander feared would be the most challenging period of his life. As he prepared to face the battles ahead, one thought echoed in his mind. How could the woman who had sworn to protect the crown have been the one to threaten its very existence? The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Clarence House as Alexander made his way through the formal reception rooms toward Victoria's private study. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the evidence in his briefcase seeming to grow with every passing moment. He had spent the morning with James Weatherby and a trusted forensics expert, confirming what he had hoped against hope would prove to be an elaborate forgery. Instead, every test, every analysis, every verification had pointed to the same devastating conclusion: the documents were authentic. Victoria's study reflected her personality perfectly: elegant, precisely organized, and intimidating in its formality. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes on constitutional law, royal protocol, and British history. Her massive desk, a gift from the President of Germany, dominated the center of the room, its surface immaculate except for a single fountain pen and a crystal paperweight bearing the royal coat of arms. Alexander had called ahead, requesting a private meeting under the pretense of discussing upcoming state business. Victoria had readily agreed, as she always did when matters of royal duty were involved. Her dedication to her role had never been questioned, which made the evidence in his briefcase all the more shocking and incomprehensible. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 3 times as Victoria entered the room. At 52, she remained striking, her silver hair always perfectly styled and her bearing unmistakably regal. She wore a navy blue suit that emphasized her authority while maintaining the understated elegance that had become her signature style. Her smile was warm but professional as she greeted her stepson. "Alexander, how lovely to see you. I trust your morning at Windsor was productive." Her voice carried the precise diction she had cultivated over years of public speaking, each word carefully chosen and delivered with practiced grace. It was illuminating. "Thank you," Alexander replied, the irony of his word choice not lost on him. "Victoria, we need to discuss something of the utmost importance. Please have a seat." Something in his tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the situation, because her expression shifted subtly. The warm smile remained, but Alexander could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She settled into the burgundy leather chair across from his position near the fireplace, her posture maintaining its characteristic perfect straightness. "Of course. What matter requires such formality?" she asked, folding her hands in her lap with practiced composure. Alexander set his briefcase on the small table between them, the soft click of the latches echoing in the quiet room. He had rehearsed this moment during the drive from Windsor, but now that he faced Victoria directly, all his prepared words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Last evening, your vehicle experienced mechanical difficulties." He began carefully, watching her face for any sign of recognition or concern. "Yes, most inconvenient. I hope the repairs won't be too extensive," Victoria replied smoothly, though Alexander noticed her fingers tighten almost imperceptibly around each other. During the routine security inspection, something was discovered that requires immediate explanation. Alexander opened the briefcase and withdrew the manila envelope, placing it on the table between them. "These items were found in a concealed compartment in your Bentley." Victoria's eyes fixed on the envelope, and Alexander saw something he had never witnessed before, a crack in her composed facade. For just a moment, her carefully maintained expression wavered, revealing what might have been fear or perhaps resignation. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Alexander," she said, but her voice had lost some of its usual confidence. "I'm not implying anything. I am stating facts." Alexander opened the envelope and withdrew the first photograph, placing it face up on the table. "This photograph shows you meeting with Marcus Pemberton 6 months ago. Would you care to explain the nature of this meeting?" Victoria leaned forward to examine the photograph, and Alexander watched as the color drained from her face. For several long moments, the only sound in the room was the steady ticking of the antique clock. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this?" "That's not the question that needs answering," Alexander replied firmly. "The question is why you were meeting secretly with a man known to have connections to foreign intelligence services." Victoria sat back in her chair, her hands now visibly trembling despite her efforts to maintain control. The transformation was startling. The confident queen consort was being replaced before his eyes by a woman who looked suddenly vulnerable and afraid. "Alexander, you don't understand the full situation," she began, but he cut her off by placing the second photograph on the table. "Then, help me understand. Explain why you're accepting what appears to be a payment from Mr. Pemberton." Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Alexander saw something that shocked him more than anything else could have: tears. In all the years he had known her, through state occasions and family crises, private moments, and public scrutinies, he had never seen Victoria cry. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I never intended for it to go this far. I never meant to betray the crown or your father's memory." Alexander felt his heart sink as her words confirmed his worst fears. The evidence was not fabricated, not taken out of context, not part of some elaborate misunderstanding. Victoria was guilty of exactly what the documents suggested. "Then, tell me what it is," Alexander said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been selling state secrets to foreign agents." Victoria stood abruptly and moved to the window, her back to Alexander as she stared out at the carefully manicured gardens. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Alexander realize how much she had been carrying alone. "It started innocently enough. Marcus approached me at a charity function 2 years ago. He was charming, well-connected, and he seemed genuinely interested in supporting various causes I championed. We began meeting occasionally to discuss potential donations and charitable partnerships. And when did these innocent meetings become treasonous? Alexander asked, his voice harder than he intended. Victoria flinched at his words but continued. About 8 months ago, Marcus mentioned that he had clients who were interested in understanding British policy positions on certain international matters. Nothing classified, he assured me, just general insights that might help them make better business decisions. Alexander withdrew the financial documents from the envelope and spread them across the table. These bank records show payments totaling over £3 million, Victoria. That's far beyond the scope of charitable donations or business consulting. She turned from the window to face him, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. The sight was so incongruous with her usual dignity that Alexander felt a pang of sympathy despite his anger and disappointment. "I know how it looks," she said, "but you have to understand I never provided anything that I thought would harm Britain or the Crown. The information I shared was policy analysis, economic forecasts, things that would become public knowledge eventually anyway. That's not your determination to make." Alexander's control finally cracked, his voice rising with the force of his emotion. "You swore an oath to protect the crown, to serve the realm, to put the interests of the people above all else. How could you justify taking money from foreign agents, regardless of what information you provided?" Victoria sank back in her chair, her composure completely shattered. "Because I was terrified," she whispered. "Terrified that I wasn't worthy of the position, that I could never fill your mother's shoes, that the people would never truly accept me as their queen. Marcus made me feel valued, important, like I had something unique to offer." Alexander stared at her in disbelief. "So you sold out your country for validation?" "I sold out nothing." Victoria's voice flared with sudden anger, a glimpse of the strength that had sustained her through years of public scrutiny. "Everything I provided was carefully considered. I made sure nothing truly sensitive ever left my hands." "You made sure?" Alexander grabbed the contract from the envelope and slammed it on the table. "This document commits you to providing privileged information regarding state matters. Your signature is right there, Victoria. How do you explain this away?" Victoria looked at the contract as if seeing it for the first time, though Alexander knew she must have read it before signing. Her face went pale again, and she seemed to age years in the span of moments. That was Marcus's idea. He said his clients needed some kind of formal agreement for their records, but that it didn't change anything about our arrangement. "I thought it was just paperwork." "Just paperwork?" Alexander's voice dripped with disbelief. "This is a contract to commit treason, Victoria. This single document could destroy everything our family has built over centuries." The room fell silent except for the sound of Victoria's quiet sobbing. Alexander felt torn between rage and pity, between his duty to the crown and his affection for the woman who had tried so hard to be a mother to him. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming, but one thing was crystal clear. This scandal could not remain hidden. "Who else knows about this?" Victoria asked between sobs. "Currently, only James Weatherby and myself. But, Victoria, you have to understand that this cannot stay secret. The evidence is too substantial, too dangerous to the crown's security." Victoria looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Alexander, please. If this becomes public, it won't just destroy me. It will bring down the entire monarchy. Everything your father worked for, everything we've tried to build together, it will all be lost." Alexander felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. She was right. If this scandal broke, it would create a constitutional crisis unlike anything Britain had seen in modern times. The public's faith in the institution would be shattered, and the political ramifications could threaten the very existence of the monarchy. But allowing it to remain hidden felt like a betrayal of everything he had been raised to believe in. How could he become king knowing that his stepmother had sold state secrets? How could he look his future subjects in the eye knowing that he had covered up such a fundamental betrayal of trust? "What do you want me to do, Victoria?" Alexander asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion and conflict. Give me a chance to make this right, she pleaded. Let me end my relationship with Marcus, return whatever money I can, and we can find a way to minimize the damage. Please, Alexander, don't let my mistakes destroy everything we've worked so hard to protect. Alexander studied her face, seeing not the composed queen consort, but a frightened woman who had made terrible choices and was now facing the consequences. The decision he made in the next few moments would determine not only Victoria's fate, but potentially the future of the British monarchy itself. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the room. Outside, London continued its relentless pace. Millions of people going about their daily lives, unaware that within the walls of Clarence House, the future of their nation's oldest institution hung in the balance. Alexander picked up the contract and studied Victoria's signature one more time. The implications were staggering, but perhaps there was still a way to contain the damage. Perhaps, with careful handling and strategic thinking, they could find a path through this crisis that preserved both justice and the stability of the crown. But as he looked at the evidence spread across the table, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. If Victoria had been selling secrets to Marcus Pemberton, what other dangerous relationships might she have cultivated? What other threats to national security might be lurking in the shadows of the royal family's private dealings? The conversation was far from over, and Alexander suspected that the revelations he had already uncovered might pale in comparison to what was yet to be revealed. The secure meeting room in the basement of MI5 headquarters felt like a tomb, its windowless walls and sterile fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere of clinical urgency. Alexander sat at the polished metal table, flanked by James Weatherby and Sir Edmund Hartley, the Director General of MI5. Across from them sat Agent Sarah Chun, a specialist in counterintelligence whose reputation for thoroughness was matched only by her discretion. The evidence for Victoria's vehicle was spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle that revealed an increasingly disturbing picture. Your Royal Highness, Sir Edmund began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in intelligence work. What we've uncovered in the past 48 hours goes far beyond what was initially discovered. I'm afraid the situation is considerably more grave than we first assessed. Alexander felt his stomach tighten. Since confronting Victoria 2 days ago, he had hoped against hope that the scope of her betrayal was limited to the evidence they had already found. Her tearful confession had seemed complete, her remorse genuine, and her promises to cooperate absolute. Now, looking at the grim faces around the table, he realized his optimism had been naive. What have you found? Alexander asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Agent Chen opened a thick manila folder and withdrew several photographs. We've been conducting surveillance on Marcus Pemberton since your security chief contacted us. These images were taken yesterday evening at his private residence in Belgravia. The first photograph showed Victoria's distinctive silver Jaguar parked outside an elegant townhouse. Alexander recognized the vehicle immediately. It was her personal car, the one she used for private engagements when she wanted to maintain a lower profile than the official state vehicles allowed. This was taken at 11:30 p.m., Agent Chen continued, placing a second photograph on the table. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. The image showed Victoria entering the townhouse, her face partially obscured by a scarf, but unmistakably her. Alexander felt a wave of anger and disappointment wash over him. After their confrontation, after her promises to end all contact with Pemberton, she had immediately resumed their dangerous relationship. There's more, Sir Edmund said grimly. We've been monitoring Pemberton's communications for the past 2 days. This morning, we intercepted several encrypted messages that suggest he's preparing to make significant financial transactions. The timing coincides perfectly with his meeting with the Queen Consort. Alexander rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. Are you saying she's still providing him with information? We believe so, Agent Chen replied. But The nature of the information has escalated dramatically. According to our analysis of the communication patterns, Pemberton is now seeking intelligence related to upcoming NATO discussions and Britain's position on several sensitive defense matters. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Alexander had hoped they were dealing with a case of poor judgment and misplaced trust. Instead, they were confronting active espionage at the highest levels of the British government. "Sir Edmund," Alexander said slowly, "I need to understand the full scope of the threat we're facing. How much damage could Victoria potentially cause if this continues?" The Director General exchanged glances with Agent Shun before responding. "Your Royal Highness, the Queen Consort has access to briefing materials that cover virtually every aspect of British foreign policy and defense strategy. She attends Privy Council meetings, receives diplomatic briefings, and has clearance for classified information that could compromise ongoing operations in dozens of countries." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. In his focus on protecting the monarchy's reputation, he had underestimated the broader national security implications of Victoria's betrayal. This wasn't just about royal scandal. It was about the safety and security of the entire nation. "What are our options?" Alexander asked. James Weatherby, who had remained silent throughout most of the briefing, finally spoke. "Sir, with respect, I believe we need to consider the possibility that the Queen Consort is being coerced rather than operating entirely of her own free will." All eyes turned to James, whose experience in royal security had taught him to consider every angle of a potential threat. "What makes you say that?" Sir Edmund asked. "The timeline," James replied, pulling out a calendar and pointing to various dates. "The escalation in both the value of payments and the sensitivity of information corresponds almost exactly with several personal events in the Queen Consort's life. Her sister's medical bills, her son's business difficulties, her mother's care facility expenses, all of these have created financial pressures that coincide with increases in her cooperation with Pemberton." Agent Shun leaned forward with interest. "You're suggesting blackmail?" "I'm suggesting that what began as poor judgment may have evolved into coercion," James clarified. "If Pemberton has been systematically creating situations where the Queen Consort feels she has no choice but to cooperate, then we may be dealing with a more sophisticated operation than simple recruitment." Alexander considered this possibility, and it offered both hope and additional concern. If Victoria was being blackmailed, it might explain her continued cooperation despite their confrontation. But it also suggested that Pemberton and his associates were far more dangerous than they had initially assumed. "How do we determine which scenario we're facing?" Alexander asked. Sir Edmund stood and began pacing behind his chair. "We have several options, but all of them carry significant risks. We could confront Pemberton directly, but that would alert him to our knowledge of his operation and potentially cause him to flee or destroy evidence. We could place the Queen Consort under direct surveillance, but the constitutional implications of spying on a member of the royal family are staggering." Or, Agent Shun added quietly, "we could ask the Queen Consort to cooperate with us in a controlled operation to gather evidence against Pemberton and identify any other members of his network." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. "You're talking about asking Victoria to become a double agent?" "In essence, yes," Sir Edmund confirmed. "It's extraordinarily risky, both personally for her and politically for the Crown. But it might be our best chance to understand the full scope of the threat and neutralize it without causing a constitutional crisis." The weight of the decision pressed down on Alexander's shoulders. Every option seemed to lead to potential disaster, but the status quo was clearly unsustainable. Victoria's continued contact with Pemberton proved that she either couldn't or wouldn't end the relationship voluntarily. What would such an operation entail? Alexander asked. Agent Shin opened another file and spread out a series of documents. "We would equip the Queen Consort with recording devices and instruct her to gather information about Pemberton's network, his other contacts, and his ultimate objectives. She would continue to attend meetings, but under our supervision and with carefully controlled information that couldn't compromise national security. And if she refuses to cooperate? Alexander asked. Then we would have no choice but to arrest her on charges of espionage, Sir Edmund said bluntly. The evidence we already have is sufficient to support such charges, and her continued contact with Pemberton only strengthens the case against her. Alexander stood and walked to the far end of the room, staring at a map of Britain that covered most of the wall. The red pins marking various security installations seemed to mock him. How many of these locations might have been compromised by Victoria's actions? How long will we have to decide? Alexander asked. Pemberton is scheduled to leave the country in 6 days, Agent Shin replied. According to intercepted communications, he's planning to meet with contacts in Geneva and Moscow. If we don't act before he leaves, we may lose our opportunity to fully understand his operation. Alexander turned back to face the group. And if we allow him to leave, then we'll spend years trying to determine what information was compromised and how much damage was done to British interests around the world, Sir Edmund said grimly. We'll also face the possibility that Pemberton will establish new networks and continue his operations from abroad. The room fell silent as Alexander grappled with the impossible choice before him. Confronting Victoria again would require him to reveal the extent of their surveillance and potentially destroy any remaining trust between them. Asking her to cooperate in a sting operation would put her in enormous personal danger and could expose the royal family to even greater scandal if the operation went wrong. But allowing Pemberton to escape with whatever secrets he had already obtained was unthinkable. The man had systematically exploited Victoria's vulnerabilities to gain access to some of Britain's most sensitive information. The damage he could cause if he continued his operations was incalculable. I need to speak with Victoria again, Alexander said finally. But this time I want to understand exactly how deeply she's involved and whether she's acting voluntarily or under duress. With respect, sir, James interjected, I don't think a private conversation will give us the answers we need. If the Queen Consort is being coerced, she may not be free to speak honestly even to you. Agent Shin nodded in agreement. We've developed protocols for these situations. With your permission, we could monitor the conversation and provide you with guidance to help determine her true circumstances. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. The idea of allowing MI5 to eavesdrop on a private conversation with his stepmother felt like a profound violation of family trust. But then, again, Victoria had already violated that trust in ways he was still struggling to comprehend. What exactly are you proposing? Alexander asked. A meeting in a controlled environment, Sir Edmund explained. Somewhere that appears private and comfortable, but where we can monitor the conversation and provide you with real-time analysis of her responses. We have techniques for determining whether someone is speaking truthfully or under the influence of external pressure. Alexander looked around the room at the faces of the people who were tasked with protecting British national security. Their expressions were grave but determined, and he realized that they were offering him a chance to save both his stepmother and his country, if such a thing were possible. Very well, Alexander said, his voice heavy with resignation and resolve. Set up the meeting. But I want to be clear about something. If Victoria is truly a victim of coercion, then our primary objective is to protect her while neutralizing the threat. If she's a willing participant in espionage, then she'll face the full consequences of her actions, regardless of her position or our family relationship. Sir Edmund nodded approvingly. Understood, Your Royal Highness. We'll begin preparations immediately. As the meeting concluded and the various officials began gathering their files and preparing to leave, Alexander remained seated, staring at the photographs of Victoria entering Pemberton's house. The woman who had tried so hard to be worthy of the crown had instead become its greatest threat. Whether she was victim or villain remained to be determined. But one thing was certain. The next few days would determine not only her fate, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. The sterile walls of the MI5 basement suddenly felt like the walls of a prison, and Alexander realized that regardless of the outcome of their investigation, nothing would ever be the same again. The innocence of his relationship with Victoria, the trust he had placed in her commitment to the crown, the faith he had in the security of the institution he would one day lead, all of it had been shattered by the evidence spread across the metal table. As he prepared to leave, Agent Shin approached him with a final thought that would haunt him in the days to come. "Your Royal Highness," she said quietly, "there's one more thing you should consider. If Marcus Pemberton has been sophisticated enough to compromise a member of the royal family, it's unlikely that the Queen Consort is his only target. We may be looking at a broader intelligence operation that has infiltrated other levels of government and society." Alexander felt his heart sink as the full implications of her words sank in. Victoria's betrayal might be just the tip of an iceberg that could threaten the very foundations of British democracy and security. The battle ahead would be far more complex and dangerous than he had imagined, and the stakes were higher than he had ever dreamed possible. The private dining room at Brooks's club seemed an unlikely venue for what might be the most crucial conversation in the history of the British monarchy. Alexander had chosen the location carefully, neutral ground that would appear natural for a family meeting while providing MI5 with the technical capabilities they needed to monitor every word. The 19th century oil paintings and crystal chandeliers created an atmosphere of refined elegance that belied the electronic surveillance equipment hidden within the walls. Alexander arrived 30 minutes early, using the time to review the strategy Agent Shun had outlined. Hidden microphones would capture every nuance of conversation, while sophisticated software would analyze Victoria's voice patterns for signs of deception or distress. In his jacket pocket, a nearly invisible earpiece would allow MI5 analysts to provide real-time guidance if the conversation took unexpected turns. Victoria entered the room at precisely 8 o'clock, her punctuality as reliable as always. She had chosen an elegant black dress that emphasized her dignity while somehow making her appear smaller and more vulnerable than usual. Her greeting was warm but cautious, her eyes searching Alexander's face for clues about the nature of their meeting. "Alexander, how thoughtful of you to suggest dinner," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "It feels like ages since we've had a proper conversation." The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. Their last proper conversation had ended with her tearful confession and promises she had immediately broken. But Alexander forced a smile and played his role, understanding that the success of the evening's mission depended on his ability to appear relaxed and unsuspicious. "I thought it was time we discussed some family matters without the usual palace protocols," Alexander replied, gesturing for the waiter to pour their wine. "There's been so much happening lately that I feel we've lost touch." Victoria's smile flickered slightly, a micro-expression that Alexander hoped the surveillance team was capturing. Throughout the first course, their conversation remained deliberately superficial. Upcoming royal engagements, family gossip, neutral topics that allowed both of them to settle into the evening's rhythm. It wasn't until the main course arrived that Alexander began steering the conversation toward more sensitive territory. Agent Shin's voice whispered in his ear, so softly he almost missed it. "Her stress levels are elevated but consistent with normal anxiety. No signs of external monitoring or coercion yet." "Victoria," Alexander said, setting down his fork, "I've been thinking a great deal about our conversation the other day, about Marcus Pemberton and the complications he's brought into your life." Victoria's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she reached for her wine glass. "Alexander, I told you that situation was resolved. I've ended all contact with Marcus and his associates." "Have you?" Alexander asked gently, though he knew the answer. "Because I'm concerned that ending such a relationship might not be as simple as you suggested." For a moment, Victoria's composure cracked, revealing a flash of something that might have been fear or desperation. She quickly recovered, but not before the surveillance equipment had captured her genuine emotional response. "I don't understand what you're implying," Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled. Agent Chin's voice whispered in Alexander's ear again. Significant deception indicators. Her vocal stress patterns suggest she's actively hiding information. Alexander leaned forward, adopting a tone of concerned intimacy. Victoria, I need you to understand that I'm not here to judge you or punish you. I'm here because I'm worried about you, and I suspect that your involvement with Pemberton may be more complicated than you've been able to tell me. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since their confrontation, Alexander saw genuine vulnerability rather than practiced emotion. Alexander, please don't ask me questions I can't answer, she whispered. Can't answer? Or won't answer? Alexander pressed gently. Can't, Victoria said, her voice breaking. There are things, people, complications that you don't understand. Agent Chin's voice was urgent now. Clear indicators of external pressure. She's trying to communicate without saying something directly. Keep pressing. Victoria, are you in danger? Alexander asked directly. Victoria looked around the room nervously, as if expecting to see someone watching them. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet Alexander had to strain to hear her. Marcus isn't just a businessman, Alexander. The people he works with, they don't accept resignation letters. Once you're involved with them, you're involved permanently. Alexander felt his blood run cold. Are you saying you're being forced to continue providing information? I'm saying that the consequences of stopping would be severe. Not just for me, but for people I care about. What kind of consequences? Alexander asked, though he was beginning to understand the answer. Victoria glanced around the room again, then leaned closer to Alexander. My son David's business troubles weren't accidental. The debts that forced him to the brink of bankruptcy were engineered. Marcus made them disappear in exchange for my cooperation, but he made it very clear that they could return, along with other problems, if I stopped being useful. Agent Chin's voice confirmed what Alexander had suspected. Classic coercion pattern. Financial manipulation followed by escalating threats. She's definitely under duress. Victoria, what other threats has he made? My mother's care facility receives anonymous donations that cover most of her expenses. My sister's medical treatments for her cancer, treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, are being paid for by a charitable foundation that Marcus controls. Victoria's voice was hollow with despair. He's made himself indispensable to everyone I love, and he's made it clear that my family's welfare depends on my continued cooperation. Alexander reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I was ashamed, Victoria said, tears flowing freely now. I got involved willingly at first, thinking I was so smart and sophisticated. By the time I realized what Marcus really was, it was too late. I was trapped, and bringing you into it would have just given him leverage over you as well. What exactly has he asked you to provide recently? Alexander asked. Victoria pulled her hand away and wiped her eyes with her napkin. Information about upcoming NATO meetings. Britain's position on the situation in Eastern Europe. Economic forecasts that could affect currency markets. Military deployment schedules. Each item on the list made Alexander's heart sink further. Victoria had access to all of this information through her role as Queen Consort, and the intelligence she was providing could compromise British interests across multiple theaters of operation. Agent Chin's voice was urgent. We need to know about his network and timeline. Ask about his travel plans and associates. Victoria, Marcus is planning to leave the country soon. Do you know where he's going and why? Victoria nadie miserably. Geneva first, then Moscow. He has meetings with what he calls his principals, the people who are ultimately paying for the information I provide. He's told me that after these meetings, my role will become even more important. More important how? He wants me to begin hosting social gatherings where I can make contact with other government officials and diplomatic personnel. He's particularly interested in defense ministers from NATO countries and European Union economic advisors. Alexander felt sick as he realized the scope of Pemberton's ambitions. Victoria wasn't just a source of information. She was being positioned as a recruitment tool for a much larger espionage network. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you willing to help us stop Marcus and his operation? Victoria looked at him with a mixture of hope and terror. Alexander, if I help you, what happens to my family? David, my mother, my sister. They'll all suffer if Marcus discovers I betrayed him. We can protect them, Alexander said, hoping he was making a promise the intelligence services could keep. But only if we act quickly and decisively. Victoria was quiet for several long minutes, staring at her untouched dessert as she wrestled with the impossible choice before her. Finally, she looked up at Alexander with a determination he hadn't seen from her in years. What do you need me to do? Agent Chin's voice was filled with professional satisfaction. Excellent work. We have everything we need to proceed. First, you need to know that this conversation has been monitored by MI5, Alexander said gently. I'm sorry for the deception, but we needed to understand whether you were acting voluntarily or under coercion. Victoria looked shocked, but not angry. How long have you known? We suspected for several days. Tonight confirmed that you're a victim rather than a willing participant in espionage. What happens now? Alexander took a deep breath before explaining the plan that Agent Chun was outlining in his earpiece. Tomorrow, you'll meet with Marcus as scheduled, but you'll be carrying recording equipment, and you'll be providing him with information that we've carefully prepared, information that appears valuable but won't actually compromise national security. The goal is to gather evidence of his operation and identify his network before he leaves the country. Victoria's face went pale. Alexander, if he discovers what I'm doing, he'll kill me. These people don't hesitate to eliminate threats. We'll be monitoring you constantly, Alexander assured her. At the first sign of danger, we'll intervene. But, Victoria, this is our only chance to end this nightmare. If we let Marcus leave the country, you'll never be free of his control. Victoria stared out the window at the London streets below, watching the normal people going about their normal lives, unaware that the security of their nation was being discussed in the elegant room above their heads. All right, she said finally, I'll do it. But, Alexander, if something happens to me, promise me you'll protect David and my mother and sister. Promise me they won't pay for my mistakes. I promise, Alexander said, though he wondered if it was a promise he could keep. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Alexander realized that the hardest part of their ordeal was still ahead. Tomorrow, Victoria would walk into what could be a trap, carrying the hopes of British intelligence and the weight of the Crown's future on her shoulders. If the operation succeeded, they might finally be free of Marcus Pemberton's threat. If it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for Victoria, but for the entire royal family and the nation they served. The game had changed from defense to offense, but the stakes remained higher than Alexander had ever imagined possible. The morning of the operation dawned gray and drizzly, London's typical autumn weather providing perfect cover for the extraordinary drama about to unfold. In a nondescript van parked across the street from Marcus Pemberton's Belgravia townhouse, Alexander sat surrounded by MI5's finest surveillance specialists, watching multiple monitors that would track every moment of Victoria's dangerous mission. Agent Chun adjusted her headset and ran through final equipment checks while Sir Edmund Hartley reviewed the operation parameters one last time. The recording devices Victoria carried were so sophisticated they could capture whispered conversations from across a room, while her location tracker would allow the team to monitor her position within inches. But, despite all the technology, everyone in the van knew that Victoria's safety ultimately depended on her ability to maintain her performance under extraordinary pressure. Phoenix is approaching the target location, came the voice of the surveillance team positioned at the end of the street. Phoenix, Victoria's operational code name, was walking slowly toward Pemberton's house, her outward composure masking what Alexander knew must be overwhelming terror. Through the monitors, they watched Victoria pause at the front door, taking a deep breath before pressing the doorbell. She looked every inch the elegant queen consort, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her dark blue suit projecting an image of confidence and authority. Only Alexander could detect the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her skirt while waiting for the door to open. Audio check. Agent Chen whispered into her microphone. Victoria's voice came through clearly. The weather is quite pleasant for October. The prearranged phrase confirmed that all her recording equipment was functioning properly. Marcus Pemberton opened the door with his characteristic charming smile, greeting Victoria with the kind of warmth that had initially drawn her into his web of deception. Through the hidden cameras, Alexander could see why Victoria had been vulnerable to his manipulation. Pemberton was handsome, well-dressed, and possessed the kind of charisma that made people want to trust him. "Victoria, my dear, how lovely to see you," Pemberton said, gesturing for her to enter. "I trust you've given careful thought to our last conversation." As Victoria disappeared into the house, the surveillance team switched to the backup monitoring system they had installed during a previous reconnaissance mission. The audio remained crystal clear as Victoria was led into Pemberton's study, a room lined with expensive books and decorated with artifacts that suggested extensive international travel. "Marcus, I want to discuss the sustainability of our arrangement," Victoria began, following the script Agent Chun had prepared. "The risks are becoming quite significant." Pemberton's laugh was cold and calculating. "My dear Victoria, I think you misunderstand the nature of our relationship. This isn't a business partnership that you can simply terminate when it becomes inconvenient." Alexander felt his jaw clench as he heard the menacing tone in Pemberton's voice. This was the first time they had recorded evidence of his threatening behavior, and it confirmed everything Victoria had told them about her coercion. "I've been extremely cooperative," Victoria replied, her voice steady despite what Alexander knew must be racing fear. "But surely you can understand my concerns about escalating the scope of our activities." "Actually, I have some exciting news about exactly that," Pemberton said, and Alexander could hear papers rustling as he apparently consulted some documents. "My principals have been so pleased with the quality of information you've provided that they're prepared to significantly increase their investment in our partnership." Agent Chun made rapid notes as Pemberton began outlining plans that went far beyond what they had anticipated. He spoke of establishing a network of social gatherings hosted by Victoria, where she would systematically cultivate relationships with key government officials and foreign diplomats. The operation he described would transform Victoria from a single intelligence source into the center of a comprehensive espionage network. "The beauty of your position," Pemberton continued, "is that no one suspects the queen consort of gathering intelligence. You have access to people and information that my other associates could never reach." "Your other associates?" Victoria asked, seizing on the reference with perfect timing. Pemberton's voice carried a note of pride as he began describing his network. He mentioned contacts in the Defense Ministry, sources within the Foreign Office, and what he called his crown jewel, a highly placed official in the Treasury who had been providing economic intelligence for over 2 years. Alexander and Agent Chun exchanged glances of alarm. The scope of Pemberton's operation was far larger than they had imagined, and the damage to British security could be catastrophic. Each name Pemberton mentioned would trigger immediate investigation and potential arrests, but they needed to gather as much information as possible before moving to shut down the network. "I'm particularly excited about next week's NATO summit," Pemberton continued. "The advanced briefing materials you'll receive will be invaluable to my client's strategic planning. They're prepared to pay exceptionally well for insights into Britain's negotiating positions." This was exactly what Agent Chun had been waiting for. Pemberton had just admitted to planning the theft of NATO classified information, which constituted an act of war against multiple allied nations. The recording they were making would be sufficient to prosecute him for the most serious espionage charges possible. But then something went wrong. "Victoria, you seem unusually tense today," Pemberton observed, his voice suddenly suspicious. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Alexander felt his heart skip a beat as he watched Victoria's vital signs spike on the monitoring equipment. Agent Shin leaned forward, whispering urgent instructions into her microphone. "Stay calm. Maintain your cover story. I'm simply concerned about the increasing risks, Victoria replied, but Alexander could hear the strain in her voice. The palace security reviews are becoming more thorough, and I worry about discovery. Pemberton mused, and the team could hear him moving around the room. You know, Victoria, in my line of work, paranoia is a survival skill. And right now, something feels different about you. Alexander watched in horror as the surveillance monitors showed Pemberton approaching Victoria with what appeared to be a small electronic device. Agent Chin immediately recognized it as a signal detector capable of identifying hidden recording equipment. Sir Edmund, Agent Chun whispered urgently. We need to be prepared to intervene immediately. But before anyone could respond, Pemberton's voice cut through the audio with chilling certainty. Victoria, my dear, you're wearing a wire. The next few seconds unfolded with terrifying speed. Victoria's panicked voice came through the speakers. Marcus, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult my intelligence, Pemberton snapped. The question is whether you're working with MI5 or if they're simply monitoring you without your knowledge. Alexander grabbed Agent Chin's arm. We have to go in now. Not yet, Sir Edmund said firmly. If we move too early, we lose our chance to identify his full network. Through the audio, they could hear Pemberton forcing Victoria to admit her cooperation with British intelligence. His voice was no longer charming. It was cold, professional, and absolutely deadly. Victoria, you've disappointed me greatly, Pemberton said. But you've also provided me with valuable information about MI5's capabilities and methods. My principals will find this intelligence quite useful. Alexander realized with growing horror that Pemberton was treating Victoria's betrayal as just another intelligence opportunity. The man was so confident in his position that he saw even his own exposure as a chance to gather information about British intelligence operations. What happens now? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, my dear, we're going to take a little trip. My clients are very eager to meet you personally and discuss the full extent of your cooperation with British intelligence. Agent Chun was already coordinating with the tactical teams positioned around the building. All units, prepare for immediate entry. Phoenix is in imminent danger. But Pemberton had anticipated this possibility. The monitors showed him producing a pistol and positioning himself behind Victoria as he moved toward what appeared to be a rear exit from the house. If your MI5 friends are listening, Pemberton said directly into Victoria's recording device, they should know that any attempt to interfere will result in the immediate execution of their asset. We have exit strategies that your people couldn't have anticipated. Alexander felt helpless as he watched the woman who had tried so hard to be his mother being used as a human shield by the man who had systematically destroyed her life. The operation that was supposed to free Victoria from Pemberton's control had instead delivered her directly into his hands. Sir Edmund, we have to do something, Alexander said desperately. We are, the Director General replied grimly. But this man is a professional, and he's prepared for exactly this scenario. As the surveillance team watched, Pemberton guided Victoria through a series of passages that appeared to connect his house to neighboring buildings. Within minutes, they had disappeared from view of all the surveillance equipment, leaving the MI5 team with no way to track their location. Agent Chin's voice was tight with professional disappointment. We've lost Phoenix. The target has activated pre-planned escape protocols. Alexander stared at the blank monitors, his mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. Victoria was now in the hands of international intelligence operatives who would almost certainly torture her for information about British security services before disposing of her. The royal family faced an unprecedented scandal that would rock the monarchy to its foundations. And Marcus Pemberton had escaped with knowledge of MI5's operational methods that would compromise British intelligence operations for years to come. But, perhaps worst of all, Alexander realized that by forcing Victoria into this operation, he had essentially signed her death warrant. The woman who had tried so hard to protect the crown had been sacrificed in an attempt to save it, and Alexander would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. as sirens began wailing in the distance, and tactical teams moved to secure Pemberton's abandoned house. Alexander understood that this was not the end of the crisis, but rather the beginning of an even more dangerous phase. Somewhere in London, Victoria was being held by people who would stop at nothing to protect their intelligence operations. And Alexander, as the future King of England, would have to find a way to save her while protecting the institution they had both sworn to serve. The game had changed once again, but now the stakes were measured not just in political consequences, but in human lives. And Alexander was running out of time to save the woman who had become both victim and unwitting architect of the greatest threat the British crown had faced in modern history.